Finn and Liam. How are you doing tonight? It's Aunt Claire, and tonight we're going to start the adventures of Grandfather Frog. Now, my dad, your great grandfather, his nickname was Grandfather Frog, and I've never really known why. Because the Grandfather Frog in these stories, he has a very deep voice, and my dad had a very deep voice, so perhaps that's it. But the Grandfather Frog in the stories, he likes to eat foolish green flies. And my dad didn't like to eat foolish green flies. But I'm going to tell you a little story about my dad every time I start reading from Grandfather Frog, because my dad did like to eat some weird stuff. When I was 12 years old, it was a Saturday afternoon, and we were going to go to the hardware store together, Dad and I. And he asked me to go check the mail, the mailbox at the end of the driveway, to see if the mail had come, and it hadn't come. So we were gone about 15 minutes at the hardware store, because Dad loved to get his gadgets at the hardware store. He had every kind of tool that you could imagine. He just loved collecting them. And when we got home, Dad said, "Hey, go and check the mail again." So I did, and I said, "Oh, Dad, while we were gone, somebody ran over a squirrel at the end of our driveway." And Dad said, "What?" It came out to look, and somebody had run over a squirrel, and but had only crushed its head with their car tires. So Dad said, "This is great. We can have squirrels." So he picks up the squirrel by the tail, and he goes into the garage, and he skins it, and then he takes it in the house and he starts cooking it. Well, my mom was upstairs, and she had a beef bourguignon in the oven. That was one of her favorite dishes to make, and so the house smelled like beef bourguignon. But after about an hour or so, it started to smell like squirrel as well, cooking squirrel. And my mother came, your great grandmother, she came barreling down the stairs. She was mad as mad could be. And she said, "Tony," because that was my dad's name. She said, "Tony, what are you doing? What have you done to my beef bourguignon?" He said, No. He said, "Don't worry. I'm just cooking a squirrel." "Where did you get a squirrel?" And Dad explained that it was roadkill. And my mom got so mad at that she just, "Well, you're not going to feed that squirrel to our children." So that was my dad, and he just laughed because he thought that was very funny. And so that's my dad. He did not eat foolish green flies like Grandfather Frog, but Grandfather Frog did eat roadkill. So, okay, chapter 1. Billy Mink finds Little Joe Otter. Billy Mink ran around the edge of the Smiling Pool and turned down by the Laughing Brook. His eyes twinkled with mischief, and he hurried as only Billy can. As he passed Jerry Muskrat's house, Jerry saw him. "Hi, Billy Mink. Where are you going in such a hurry this fine morning?" he called. "To find Little Joe Otter. Have you seen anything of him?" replied Billy. "No," said Jerry. "He's probably down to the big river fishing. I heard him say last night that he was going." "Thanks," said Billy Mink. And without waiting to say more, he was off like a little brown flash. Jerry watched him out of sight. "Huh," exclaimed Jerry. "Billy Mink is in a terrible hurry this morning. Now, I wonder what he is so anxious to find Little Joe Otter for. When they get their heads together, it is usually for some mischief." Jerry climbed to the top of his house and looked over the Smiling Pool in the direction from which Billy Mink had just come. Almost at once he saw Grandfather Frog, fast asleep on his big green lily pad. The legs of a foolish green fly were sticking out of one corner of his big mouth. Jerry couldn't help laughing, for Grandfather Frog certainly did look funny. "He's had a good breakfast this morning, and his full stomach has made him sleepy," thought Jerry. "But he's getting careless in his old age. He certainly is getting careless. The idea of going to sleep right out in plain sight like that. Suddenly a new thought popped into his head. Billy Mink saw him, and that is why he is so anxious to find Little Joe Otter. He is planning to play some trick on Grandfather Frog, as sure as pollywogs have tails, exclaimed Jerry. Then his eyes began to twinkle as he added, I think I'll have some fun myself. Without another word, Jerry slipped down into the water and swam over to the big green lily pad of Grandfather Frog. Then he hit the water a smart blow with his tail. Grandfather Frog's big goggly eyes flew open, and he was just about to make a frightened plunge into the smiling pool when he saw Jerry. Have a nice nap? Inquired Jerry with a broad grin. And here is a picture of Jerry saying, have a nice nap, inquired Jerry with a broad grin. And you can see Grandfather Frog, and if you look closely, you can see the legs of a foolish green fly sticking out of Grandfather Frog's mouth. I wasn't asleep, protested Grandfather Frog indignantly. I was just thinking. Don't you think it a rather dangerous plan to think so long with your eyes closed? Asked Jerry. Well, maybe I did just doze off, admitted Grandfather Frog sheepishly. Maybe you did, replied Jerry. Now listen. Then Jerry whispered in Grandfather Frog's ear, and both chuckled as if they were enjoying some great joke, for they are great friends, you know. Afterward, Jerry swam back to his house, and Grandfather Frog closed his eyes so as to look just as he did when he was asleep. Meanwhile, Billy Mink had hurried down the Laughing Brook. Halfway to the big river, he met Little Joe Otter bringing home a big fish, for you know Little Joe is a great fisherman. Billy Mink hastened to tell him how Grandfather Frog had fallen fast asleep on his big green lily pad. It's a splendid chance to have some fun with Grandfather Frog and give him a great scare, concluded Billy. Little Joe Otter put his fish down and grinned. He likes to play pranks almost as well as he likes to go fishing. What can we do? Said he. I thought of a plan, replied Billy. Do you happen to know where we can find Longlegs the Blue Heron? Yeah, said Little Joe. I saw him fishing not 5 minutes ago. Then Billy told Little Joe his plan, and, laughing and giggling, the two scamps hurried off to find Longlegs the Blue Heron. Chapter 2. Longlegs the Heron receives callers. Longlegs the Blue Heron felt decidedly out of sorts. It was a beautiful morning, too beautiful for anyone to be feeling that way. Indeed, it was the same beautiful morning in which Grandfather Frog had caught so many foolish green flies. Jolly, round, red Mr. Sun was smiling his broadest. The merry little breezes of Old Mother West Wind were dancing happily here and there over the green meadows, looking for some good turn to do for others. The little feathered people to whom Old Mother Nature has given the great blessing of music in their throats were pouring out their sweetest songs. So it seemed as if there was no good reason why Longlegs should feel out of sorts. The fact is, the trouble with Longlegs was an empty stomach. Yes, sir, that is what ailed Longlegs the Blue Heron that summery, sunshiny morning. You know, it is hard to be hungry and happy at the same time. So Longlegs sat on the edge of a shallow little pool in the Laughing Brook, grumbling to himself. Just a little while before, he had seen Little Joe Otter carrying home a big fish, and this made him hungrier and even more out of sorts than ever. In the first place, it made him envious, and envy, you know, always stirs up bad feelings. He knew perfectly well that Little Joe had got that fish by boldly chasing it until he caught it, for Little Joe can swim even faster than a fish. But Longlegs chose to try to make himself think that it was just all luck. Moreover, he wanted to blame someone for his own lack of success, as most people who fail do so. So when little Joe had called out, "Hi, Longlegs, what luck this fine morning?" Longlegs just pretended not to hear, but when little Joe was out of sight and hearing, he began to grumble to himself. "No wonder that I have no luck with that fellow racing up and down the Laughing Brook," said he. "He isn't content to catch what he wants himself, but frightens all the rest of the fish, so that an honest fisherman like me has no chance at all. I don't see what Old Mother Nature was thinking when she gave him a liking for fish. He and Billy Mink are just two worthless little scamps born to make trouble for other people." He was still grumbling when these same two little scamps poked their heads out of the grass on the other side of the little pool. "You look happy, Longlegs. Must be that you have had a good breakfast," said little Joe, nudging Billy Mink. Longlegs snapped his great bill angrily. "What are you doing here, spoiling my fishing?" he demanded. "Haven't you got the Big River and all the rest of the Laughing Brook to fool around in? This is my pool, and I'll thank you to keep away." Billy Mink chuckled so that Longlegs heard him, and that didn't improve his temper a bit. But before he could say any more, little Joe Otter spoke. "Ah," said he, "we beg your pardon. We just happen to know that Grandfather Frog is fast asleep, and we thought that if you hadn't had good luck this morning, you might like to know about it. As long as you think so ill of us, we'll just run over and tell Blackcap the Night Heron." Little Joe turned as if to start off in search of Blackcap at once. "Hold on a minute," called Longlegs, and tried to make his voice sound pleasant. A difficult thing to do because, you know, his voice is very harsh and disagreeable. "The truth is, I haven't had a mouthful of breakfast, and to be hungry is apt to make me cross. Where did you say Grandfather Frog is?" "I didn't say," replied little Joe. "But if you really want to know, he is sitting on his big green lily pad in the Smiling Pool, fast asleep, right in plain sight." "Thank you," said Longlegs. "I believe I have an errand up that way, now that I think of it. I believe I'll just go over and have a look at him. I have never seen him asleep." And here's a picture of Billy Mink and little Joe Otter talking to Longlegs the Heron. And Longlegs is saying, "I believe I'll go and have a look at him," said Longlegs. Oh dear. So chapter 3, let's hope Grandfather Frog is alert, because Longlegs the Heron is coming, the blue heron is coming to visit. Longlegs the blue heron watched Billy Mink and little Joe Otter disappear down the Laughing Brook. As long as they were in sight, he sat without moving, his head drawn down between his shoulders, just as if he had nothing more important to think about than a morning nap. But if you had been near enough to have seen his keen eyes, you would never have suspected him of even thinking of a nap. Just as soon as he excuse me. Just as soon as he felt sure that the two little brown-coated scamps were out of sight, he stretched his long neck up until he was almost twice as tall as he had been a minute before. He looked this way and that way to make sure that no danger was near, spread his great wings, flapped heavily up into the air, and then, with his head once more tucked back between his shoulders and his long legs straight out behind him, he flew out over the green meadows and, making a great circle, headed straight for the Smiling Pool. All this time Billy Mink and little Joe Otter had not been so far away as Longlegs supposed. They had been hiding where they could watch him, and the instant he spread his wings, they started back up the Laughing Brook towards the Smiling Pool to see what would happen there. You see, they knew perfectly well that Longlegs was flying up to the Smiling Pool in the hope that he could catch Grandfather Frog for his breakfast. They didn't really mean any harm should come to Grandfather Frog, but they meant that he should have a great fright. You see, they were like a great many other people. so heedless and thoughtless that they thought it was fun to frighten others. Of course we'll wake Grandfather Frog in time for him to get away with nothing more than a great scare, said Little Joe Otter as they hurried along. It will be such fun to see his big goggly eyes pop out when he opens them and sees Longlegs just ready to gobble him up. And won't Longlegs be hopping mad when we cheat him out of the breakfast he is so sure he is going to have? They reached the Smiling Pool before Longlegs, who had taken a roundabout way, and they hid among the bulrushes where they could see and not be seen. "There's the old fellow, just as I left him, fast asleep," whispered Billy Mink. Sure enough, there on his great big lily pad sat Grandfather Frog with his eyes shut. At least they seemed to be shut. And over on top of his big house sat Jerry Muskrat. Jerry seemed to be too busy opening a freshwater clam to notice anything else, but the truth is, he was watching all that was going on. You see, he had suspected that Billy Mink was going to play some trick on Grandfather Frog, so he had warned him. When he had seen Longlegs coming towards the Smiling Pool, he had given Grandfather Frog another warning, and he knew that now he was only pretending to be asleep. Straight up to the Smiling Pool came Longlegs the Blue Heron, and on the very edge of it, among the bulrushes, he dropped his long legs and stood with his toes in the water, his long neck stretched up so that he could look all over the Smiling Pool. There, just as Little Joe Otter had said, sat Grandfather Frog on his big green lily pad, fast asleep. At least, he seemed to be fast asleep. The eyes of Longlegs sparkled with hunger and the thought of what a splendid breakfast Grandfather Frog would make. Very slowly, putting each foot down as carefully as he knew how, Longlegs began to walk along the shore so as to get opposite the big green lily pad where Grandfather Frog was sitting. And over in the bulrushes on the other side, Little Joe Otter and Billy Mink nudged each other and clapped their hands over their mouths to keep from laughing aloud. Chapter 4, The Patience of Longlegs the Blue Heron. Patience often wins the day when overhaste has lost the way. If there is one virtue which Longlegs the Heron possesses above another, it is patience. Yes, sir, Longlegs certainly has got patience. He believes that if a thing is worth having, it is worth waiting for, and that if he waits long enough, he is sure to get it. Perhaps that is because he has been a fisherman all of his life, and his father and his grandfather were fishermen. You know, a fisherman without patience rarely catches anything. Of course, Billy Mink and Little Joe Otter laugh at this and say it isn't so. But the truth is, they sometimes grow hungry when they wouldn't if they had had a little of the patience of Longlegs. Now, Grandfather Frog is another who is very, very patient. He can sit still the longest time waiting for something to come to him. Indeed, he can sit perfectly still so long, and Longlegs can stand perfectly still so long, that Jerry Muskrat and Billy Mink and Little Joe Otter have had many long disputes as to which of the two can keep still the longest. He will make a splendid breakfast, thought Longlegs, as very, very carefully he walked along the edge of the Smiling Pool so as to get right opposite Grandfather Frog. There he stopped and looked very hard at Grandfather Frog. Yes, he certainly must be asleep, for his eyes were closed. Longlegs chuckled to himself right down inside without making a sound, and got ready to wade out so as to get within reach. Now, all the time Grandfather Frog was doing some quiet chuckling himself. You see, he wasn't asleep at all. He was just pretending to be asleep, and all the time he was watching Longlegs out of a corner of one of his big goggly eyes. Very, very slowly and carefully, so as not to make the teeniest, weeniest sound, Longlegs lifted one foot to wade out into the Smiling Pool. Grandfather Frog pretended to yawn and opened his big goggly eyes. Longlegs stood on one foot without moving so much as a feather. Grandfather Frog yawned again, not as if he were too sleepy to keep awake, and half closed his eyes. Longlegs waited and waited. Then, little by little, so slowly that if you had been there, you would have hardly seen him move, he drew his long neck down until his head rested on his shoulders. "I guess I must wait until he falls sound asleep again," said Longlegs to himself. And here's a picture of Longlegs standing on one foot. Longlegs stood on one foot without moving. But Grandfather Frog didn't go to sleep. He would nod, and then just when Longlegs would make up his mind that this time he really was asleep, open would pop Grandfather Frog's eyes. So all the long morning, Longlegs stood on one foot without moving, watching and waiting and growing hungrier and hungrier. And all the long morning, Grandfather Frog sat on his big green lily pad, pretending that he was, "Oh, so sleepy." And all the time having such a comfortable sun bath and rest, for very early he had had a good breakfast of foolish green flies. Over in the bulrushes on the other side of the Smiling Pool, two scamps in brown bathing suits waited and watched for the great fright they had planned for Grandfather Frog when they had set Longlegs to try and catch him. They were Billy Mink and Little Joe Otter. At first they laughed to themselves and nudged each other at the thought of the trick that they had played. Then, as nothing happened, they began to grow tired and uneasy. You see, they do not possess patience. Finally, they gave up in disgust and stole away to find some more exciting sport. Grandfather Frog saw them go and chuckled harder than ever to himself. All right, well, that is the first 4 chapters of Grandfather Frog. And since we've met Jerry the Muskrat, tomorrow I will tell you, before I start reading chapter 5, I'll tell you a story about my dad and how he used to buy muskrats. It's kind of a little gross, but he loved his muskrats. Good night, boys. Have a good night. It was fun reading to you.